Okay, so let's look at page 7 of your interactive notebook. This covers physical and chemical properties. And on the right side, we have some examples of physical and chemical properties along with their definitions. But I actually want to look at the left side first. So moving to the left side of your notebook, I have one sheet of paper here folded in half and then glued down to the back of it. And the top half is cut in half and can open. So I have two halves, and there you can see the bottom. I have two halves that fold out. The top one is about physical properties, and it defines physical properties as properties that can be observed without changing the identity of a substance. So in other words, these are things that we should be able to sense about a substance without actually changing its identity. So examples of that would include state of matter. So you can examine the state of matter of a substance without changing its identity. The electrical conductivity, the volume, the size, the color, whether or not it's magnetic, viscosity, all of these things can be determined about a substance without actually changing the identity of that substance. So those are just a few examples. So inside of this flap under physical property, you're going to put some of your own examples, they don't have to be the same as mine, of physical properties. On the bottom we have chemical properties. Chemical properties are properties that can only be observed during a chemical reaction. And of course, any time that we have a chemical reaction, we are going to change the identities of the reactants. So this time, these properties are ones that in order to observe them, we have to actually change what the substance is. So some examples inside would include radioactivity. In order for a substance to undergo radioactive decay, its identity is going to change. Flammability, if we light something on fire, it's going to change from whatever substance it began as to other substances. For example, the gasoline in your car, when it lights on fire, turns from gasoline, a hydrocarbon, into mostly carbon dioxide and water. And in order to determine whether or not something is flammable, you have to change its identity. Heat of combustion, we'll talk about that on the other page, but it's basically the energy released from when something combusts, whether or not it reacts with acids, and then the ability to be oxidized, and the example here is of a rusting nail, which is an example of oxidation. So for all of these, in order to observe the property, we have to actually change the identity of the substance. So those are chemical properties. So looking back on the right, we're going to define some of the properties that we just looked at and make sure that you have good scientific definitions for all of these. So the first one is mass, which we've talked about several times before. That's the amount of matter in an object. Followed by volume, which is the amount of space that a mass occupies. Note that volume doesn't have to be the amount of space inside of an object. Like, you don't have to be able to fill something in order for it to have volume. Volume is simply the amount of space that a mass occupies. It can be solid, it still has volume. All mass has volume. Density is the amount of mass per unit of volume in a substance. So within a certain amount of space, how much of that substance is there? So how much mass is within a certain amount of space for that substance. And then viscosity is a substance's ability to resist flowing. And this is one that's easy to get tricked on because it's the ability to resist flowing. So if something flows slowly and resists flowing well, then it has high viscosity. Something that flows more easily, like water, has low viscosity. On the bottom, there's some examples of chemical properties. Flammability is the first one. This is how easily a substance combusts or catches on fire. Toxicity is the ability of a substance to damage an organism, and there's lots of different ways that something can be toxic. Radioactivity, for example, would be a kind of toxicity. And then finally, heat of combustion, that's the one that we talked about on the other side. It's the amount of energy released when a substance combusts. And this is usually going to be given off as heat or light, and in the case of fire, it's both. So that amount of energy given off is heat of combustion. That's a chemical property because in order to observe it, you have to actually change the identity of the substance, light it on fire, and it undergoes a chemical reaction. So those are just some examples of physical and chemical properties, and again, this is page 7 of your interactive notebook.